Welcome again, everyone. We're now on to our next session. Another one about the user experience, how important it is. It's called You Can't Spell FIDO Without UX. And presenting, we have Kevin Goldman again, Chief Experience Officer from Trusona. And we have also with us now Sondra Barnett, who's the Principal UX Researcher from Blink. I will leave it to you two now. Thank you very much. Welcome.
Thank you, David. Make sure both of our microphones are working.
Yeah.
I think they are. All right, we're going to talk about some UX guidelines that have been mentioned a few times throughout the conference. And I want to give a little bit of background so you kind of know how things have led up to this point. I'm borrowing some of these concepts from some other folks in the Alliance, because I wasn't back in the Alliance in 2016. But if we look at the consumer branding efforts of FIDO, we look sort of the ancient history. FIDO has had an eye on consumer education for several years, starting in 2016. And some studies were performed to really gauge consumer user interest in FIDO. The general feedback from that is that consumers were interested to have some sort of visual cue, that informs them that there's this new process, this new authentication process available or happening, et cetera. And part of the reason FIDO went through a rebrand was to accommodate some of that feedback in 2016. FIDO, evaluated whether to use go with an entirely new name or not, but ultimately stuck with the name FIDO and modified the mark. And you'll kind of see how this had progressed over the years. And very purposeful in order to arrive at a mark that could be used in many different contexts throughout different user journeys. A more modern history is that Login with FIDO was launched, I believe, last year, middle of last year. And it was sort of staking the ground around consumer education as a resource for internal and external relying parties. So any service provider, providing that is FIDO certified can use the FIDO marks at point of login. And, some more research, sort of reaffirmed that there wasn't a lot of brand recognition, but there was an affinity for a visual cue. And that's what you just saw on that prior slide. So those are the visual cues. So narrowing down here, the background on the UX task force. Important that you kind of have a sense of where did this research come from, where these guidelines came from. So the task force was formed in the middle of last year from FIDO's board itself. And it's comprised of UX and design leaders from relying parties, from platform vendors, from vendors, platform providers and vendors, et cetera. It's now a pretty diverse and pretty large group, the UX task force is. And while the big companies may have a lot of UX resources internally, we're sort of also thinking about the task force to provide some guidelines for that long tail of relying parties that may not have resources internally, give the companies a good place to start with some tried and true and tested UX patterns. The first use case that was researched and taken on by the task force was for desktop authenticators in a regulated industry, specifically financial services. Couldn't boil the ocean. Let's focus in on just one use case to start. So I'll hand it to Sondra to talk about, we're going to go back and forth as we talk through the slides.
Yeah, so we really don't have time to go deep on this UX guidelines document, but we wanted to give you an overview about how they were created in an evidence-driven way in collaboration between Blink, which is a UX research and design agency here in Seattle, a couple blocks away, and the FIDO UX Task Force. So these guidelines articulate data-driven guidance to relying parties about how best to implement the FIDO enrollment and authentication experience for consumers on websites with desktop authenticators. But we believe that many of the learnings here also apply broadly to authentication experiences for a diversity of online experiences on desktop and mobile too. So the guidelines are organized by the user goals and the user journey, but they don't touch on account recovery. That was out of scope. And they provide recommendations and sample UI and messaging examples for each step of the enrollment and registration process, organized by these user goals. They're really a blueprint for relying parties to build a successful user experience and help users achieve their goals. We worked with the FIDO UX task force to create these guidelines in a very evidence-driven way. So we conducted a series of 3 different studies, which consisted of 114 consumer participants. And if you saw Kevin's talk, one of the clips was from one of those qualitative interviews. We used high-fidelity prototypes that transitioned into this live fictional banking test site that's instrumented with FIDO, and it's a reference site for this implementation that you can check out as well. But we watch consumers and listen to them. Folks who are enrolled in Windows Hello or Apple Touch ID, they use their own devices, desktop, to go through the FIDO registration flow in the context of signing into an imaginary banking website. And we listen to them narrate their experiences and describe their interpretations, and we listen to the questions and concerns and sources of confusion that they had along the way. And through that insight, we created these guidelines together. And we're going to talk about 3 key themes, learnings that apply to authentication within any online experience on mobile or desktop. And I'm going to hand it off to Kevin next to talk about one of those learnings, which is about priming.
All right, the first of the 3 themes is priming. So let's talk about what priming even is. Priming activates specific concepts in memory to influence subsequent behavior. And just a funny note, we're talking about human memory, not machine memory. So priming, you're going to see when you download, if you haven't already downloaded these UX guidelines, you're going to see examples of priming over and over and over. So this concept, it's a UX concept. You could call it even a pattern that can be reused in many, many places throughout a customer journey, an authentication journey. So let's look at just 2 examples of properly used priming. And it's funny here. It's really simple, but it's hard to arrive at that simplicity. The priming in this experience is the icon and 8 words. That icon and those 8 words do so much heavy lifting. They mean so much to these end users in different ways, and we had to figure out what icons, what words are appropriate to send the right message. At this point in the FIDO user journey, users can't enroll, but they're primed to the idea that they can enroll once they've signed in. Let's look at another example. I'm not going to read all the text because I assume you can read it faster than I can speak it. In this priming example, the priming is the icon. It's the 12 words in that toast notification there on the right. And it's also the call to action, which is register now. And this is very common, and you probably have seen it in other situations, particularly in native mobile apps, this concept of priming. So whenever a user or an app wants device access to things like the camera or geolocation, it's going to pop up an operating system dialog box. So for example, before an app can have access to the camera, it needs to ask the user, do you want to allow this app or website to have access to the camera? Make sense? You've seen this all many, many times. Push notifications. You can't just get push notifications. You have to go through the OS, and the OS shows a dialog box that says, do you allow this website or app to allow push notifications? Now, if you think about this, any app that is well designed and is accounting for a great user experience is always going to precede that OS dialog box with a custom branded set of priming. It's going to show the benefit of using the camera before you actually ask for the camera permissions. That priming will talk about the benefit of the push notifications before you ask for push notification allowance. The same goes for FIDO. When you use FIDO 2, it's going to pop up an OS security dialog. And it's going to say, do you want to use this authentication? Don't go right to the dialog. You have to precede that with what is the value that you're going to deliver to the user by asking them to allow FIDO to happen. I hope that's really clear. This notion of priming and when these OS dialog boxes pop up and what precedes them is really important.
Yeah, so that, the next learning that is, I think, broadly applicable is the importance of iconography, which Kevin alluded to. But given users' understanding about password alternatives, leading with biometrics is a very powerful way to help users feel comfortable and get a high-level understanding of what option is being offered to them. So biometric iconography, and especially the fingerprint icon, is really the familiar bridge that helps users become open to this unknown concept of FIDO at this point, right? Here on the bank homepage sign-in screen, before the user's enrolled in FIDO, leading with this fingerprint image, rather than FIDO branding, really helps users get an understanding of that this is an option. Users are really becoming familiar with biometrics, and they now have a sense that they understand what is being offered here just from that simple icon. Users intuitively understand that biometrics are convenient and secure. You can't forget your fingerprint. It's always available. It's unique to you. It's hard to hack or duplicate. So it's something that that resonates with users and they trust, even if they've been using passwords for a very long time. This biometric image, in addition to in this pre-registration phase, can be used on the home page and the login page and in this invitation text as well. However, once on the registration page, that's kind of an opportune time to introduce FIDO branding to help users make that connection between biometrics and FIDO as a new sign-in option. Another really important concept, learning that came out of this research that is part of the guideline recommendations is this concept of progressive disclosure to educate users. There's probably a lot of facts about FIDO that customers might really want to know, but we certainly cannot overwhelm them with those facts up front, right? So earlier in this enrollment flow, on the bank sign-in page and on that invitation pop-up, we used biometric imagery, and we focused on the value proposition. This is a new, easy, secure way to sign in. But on the registration page, you can reveal a bit more information, right? You can talk about what is the process of FIDO sign-in. You can explain simply that FIDO lets you sign into this bank account with the method that you already use to unlock your computer. And this might be enough for many customers to proceed, that they are familiar with biometrics, they understand how they unlock their computers, and they're ready to use that as an alternative to a password for their bank sign-in. But other customers still have questions that we discovered were barriers to proceed with registration. And so they can explore those via a Learn More link that's available for those who are interested. And we tested 7 statements that build trust in FIDO technology and clarify information that served as barriers to proceeding with the registration process. So things like FIDO technology is built into all leading desktop devices and browsers and allows users to sign in securely without a password. And it uses your computer's built-in authentication method to ensure that your sign-in information stays safe from hackers because it never leaves your computer. So that complexity is available just in time before users register, but it's really not necessary for some. And so it's available but not pushed on folks. So yeah, that was sort of a brief overview. We wanted to kind of give you a sense of some key learnings that are part of and inspire these UX guidelines. But really, we want to encourage people to download the guidelines and give us feedback about them. Check out the reference site.
Yeah, there's really 3 parts to the guidelines. So just want to make sure you know of all 3. They're equally important. The first is it's a PDF. So fidoalliance.org/UX-guidelines. And you can download that PDF there. The second part that's also really important is there is a test site. It was created by Shane and Jasmine from IBM. And it's a wonderful reference site. I still reference it all the time in my day-to-day work. And that's at digital-test.com. That's the actual domain and bits that we use during the research. And the last part that is equally as important is the FIDO Alliance. Sondra and I, a lot of folks want to hear what's helpful and what's not helpful, what you would like to see next from the UX task force. I think with that, thank you.
Thank you, Kevin and Sondra. Don't have any questions online at this point. Do we have any questions from the room? One over here. Start.
The participants, what regions were they in? Just the United States or all over the world? What cultures were involved?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this was a U.S. national test. So participants, the qualitative interviews took place over Zoom, and they were nationally distributed from different regions across the U.S. We did a round of unmoderated testing as well. Again, those were U.S., but they were across the whole country. And a good next step would be to international participants, absolutely.
So there's a number of different modalities that people use for, especially for biometrics. I mean, you have things like Touch ID and Face ID, and other things as well. I noticed that you use like some particular kind of use of a fingerprint. Did you look into any use of like some of the more platform-specific type of things? I know, for example, Apple, they have particular restrictions about using their very particular Touch ID and Face ID iconography. Any kind of recommendations or exploration on that side?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So we do recommend in the guidelines that you detect the platform that the customer's on and display iconography relevant to their platform. So if you're on a Mac OS, you're going to see a fingerprint that is native to Apple, likewise for Android or Microsoft. So we did test different icons, and we found that the fingerprint was the most recognizable biometric icon. We tested a few, the Face ID icon, Windows Hello Smile, a few others as well. So we're kind of given understanding in the market now, we feel like the fingerprint icon is most broadly associated with biometrics. Participants enrolled in Windows Hello might use a face scan instead. Some use a PIN. And so some of that text on the registration page kind of clarifies a little bit. It isn't necessarily a finger scan. It is, you're going to use the method that you use to unlock your computer to sign into your bank. We all know text is hard for folks to read, but it's part of that progressive disclosure that we start with this high level, really recognizable concept and try to reveal a little more specific information as users go through that flow.
Got a question online here, which is, what was the most surprising thing to you during your research?
Love that question. So we did a study, a remote study where folks were, that was not moderated. So folks used their own computers to go through the enrollment and registration flow of FIDO. And 98 out of 100 completed it. Like, folks were willing to, they felt safe enough to proceed through that experience. The vast majority did. And I think that that delighted and surprised me too, that I feel like people understood that, or they felt safe enough to proceed to go through that flow, to use their own desktop platform authenticator as part of this fictional banking site. How about you?
So I thought that one of the outputs that was most interesting to me was how to describe some of the details of FIDO and WebAuthn in ways that had meaning for end users. And there were a lot of users that were just concerned about security. They didn't, they haven't heard of FIDO before. They haven't heard of WebAuthn. They haven't gone through this whole behavior that's new to them. And Sondra had it up at one point in the slides. There's about 6 different bullet points of messaging around describing to end users what, alleviating their fears and describing to them what's actually going on with this process. We wouldn't have arrived at those things without doing the research. And it's not a one-to-one correlation where we come up with an idea, we test it, see if it works. It's more of Sondra does some testing, we see where the friction is, what people had difficulty understanding, and then we go back as a team and try to figure out that messaging.
Great. Next question here, live.
Hey, great work. Bob Lord, I used to work at the DNC where we helped lots of people enroll in what I like to call legacy multi-factor, lots and lots of people. One of the things that we observed was that when you sit down with people, and I'm sure you've done this with your non-technical friends and relatives, sit down and get them to use two-factor, whatever that is, on Facebook, and then try to see if they can do it on Twitter. The experience for just legacy two-factor is just very different between them. And then you try to get a third and a fourth, and you realize that there's just so much diversity. And I don't know that any one of those two-factor enrollments and usages, that UI is wrong, but the fact that it's different creates this huge barrier. And people ask a lot of very obvious questions to me and others, saying like, well, why is it this word here? Why is it that word there? Isn't that, they're different, right? No, that's actually the same thing. And so I'm just wondering about your thoughts around building more cohesive and a consistent experience between various vendors so that we don't really let 1,000 flowers bloom, that we really try to steer people the same way so that anytime you learn to enroll and then use your FIDO security keys, it's a similar experience at other places. So you pay the tax once and then amortize it. I'm sure you've thought about this, but I'd just love to hear what your thoughts are.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah, that came up and was discussed at length with the platform providers, because Google and Microsoft and Apple are all on the task force. When we looked at that user journey with FIDO, even something you're saying like a word here is different from a word here, we realized there's 9 different icons. And some of them are people, some of them are fingerprints, some of them are folders, some of them are shields, these other security symbology. And, that was a great learning. And we're taking all that learning into the task force and into FIDO and definitely working on trying to make that more consistent. That was just an example of the iconography, but the word's the same.
Right, it's this universal standard across platform, and there are a lot of technologies collaborating to make that happen, and we want to hide those seams from the customer.
Well said. Yeah.
So, last question, and I think this fits in well. What might be the future UX project from FIDO?
I'm looking over there.
Everyone's looking to
it's-
Andrew, who ran
Yeah.
it.
Andrew, if you want to answer that question, you should absolutely. I created the list the other day. It was about 10 items long, but Andrew has a better idea.
No, I'll just say, I mean, first of all, I just want to, no, what do you want me to do? Okay, camera shy. First of all, I got to say, as an anecdote, of all the work I've done at FIDO, this project was probably the coolest thing we've done. Because inside of FIDO Alliance, we have a lot of security and authentication, identity experts, but actually working with capital D designers and UX people was really cool. And so the guidelines were well received by our stakeholders and by the general public, and we want to build on this moving forward. Going back to that question. So some of the stuff Bob's raised about terminology and usability around security keys is a different use case. The thing to remember, this use case we walked through is very specific to platform authenticators for online banking. So as you look at broadening that, perhaps looking at security keys maybe for a workforce, or also further testing the FIDO visual cues that we're working on, iterating upon to understand what resonates most with consumers at large. So I think you'll see more from this task force and from FIDO on the UX front, probably midway through 2022.
Thank you, Andrew. So let's thank our presenters once again. Kevin and Sondra, thank you very much.
Thank you.